Works of scholars. This presentation focuses on this section of the specification. In particular, it highlights 4 key scholars that you will need to know about. The first is Richard Dawkins. The second is Dawkins and Westphal. The third there is Bertrand Russell. And the fourth is Frederick Copleston. Now, this presentation will only focus on Dawkins and Westphal. I have a detailed video that analyzes and takes you through the famous radio debate of Russell and Copleston. And you can go there and click on that link to see that. This includes the topic of context to critiques of religious belief. And this will include a little bit of Dawkins, but before we get to an overview of Dawkins' views and Westphal's views, let me take you through the context to critiques of religious belief. This image here shows the tension between the Age of Reason, the Enlightenment, and the Catholic Church. So let's start with key terms that you need to know. The first is atheism, which literally means without God. It refers to those people that believe that there is no God. The letter A in front of theism negates belief in God. There are 2 types of atheism. There's weak atheism, those that do not believe that God exists, but they don't explicitly believe or acknowledge that God does not exist. An example could be a newborn baby who doesn't have knowledge of God as such, therefore doesn't believe in God. Or perhaps somebody on a remote island that's never been exposed to the concept of God. There are those who are strong atheists, people that have an explicit and firm belief that God does not exist. Typically, they will have researched, they will have studied at depth religions and other ideas and come to the solid conclusion that there is no God. Anti-theism or anti-theists are those people that believe there is no God and take it further to say that it is wrong to believe that God exists, and in fact want to correct people who believe in God. They see religion and God and belief in God usually as a damaging force in the world. And finally, agnosticism. This is the belief that it's not possible to know whether God exists or not, and therefore, if you're an agnostic, you're open to the possibility of belief, but you have insufficient knowledge or insight to make a solid claim. It's worth noting that different people are on a different scale of atheism to theism, and so they may be an agnostic, but they may be leaning more towards theism or more towards atheism, or directly in the middle. Well, our starting point is reasons for atheism. So here we've got a number of key influences and developments over time that have perhaps led to the rise in atheism. This could also be considered the rise of secularization, in particular in Western Europe. Secularization is the disassociation or separation from religious or spiritual concerns. And there are some key factors to this development. The first is empiricism. You can see in this image here are a picture of some of the key thinkers of a period called the Enlightenment. And this was a time in which academia and politics experienced a shift to reason, separate from religion. There was a great emphasis on empirical knowledge and what's known as the scientific method. A philosopher, John Locke, is famous for in particular influencing empiricism, especially in one of his papers that he wrote in 1690. The belief is that knowledge can only be gained through experience, the five senses. You should be familiar with some of these ideas, having studied religious language, and A.J. Ayer accepted this view much later on with his verification principle. During this period of time, the church entered into a battle and was on the decline. Secondly, another factor for the rise of atheism is science. Science has been a catalyst for the rise of atheism, it's believed. It provides natural explanations for the universe, which previously, by the Catholic Church, was purported as miracles. The famous telescope by the likes of Copernicus and Galileo showed that the Earth was in fact not the centre of the universe. You also, in science, have Darwin's Origin of Species. And Charles Darwin argued, therefore, that everything in nature has come about through trial and error, and it doesn't suggest that there is a purpose to any of it. You also have in science the likes of Sigmund Freud and his psychoanalysis of the unconscious mind. This removed the idea within religion that there is a small still voice of God that speaks to people in their conscience, knowing right from wrong. The role of religion is to explain anything that science hasn't yet been able to. And this is what has relegated religion through science to the back seat. And it's become known as the God of the gaps theory, that what science hasn't yet discovered, religion is just still plodding along, filling in the gaps. Next up is the influence of the problem of evil and suffering. You have the logical and the evidential problems of evil by the likes of Epicurus, the Greek philosopher, John Mackey, who you will have studied the Evil and Omnipotence essay, which you can also click on my link to have a more detailed analysis of that paper, and D.Z. Phillips, who talks about the evidential problem of evil, the overwhelming amount of evil that we see in the world. This has all led to people questioning the existence of God. There's also the rejection of moral absolutes. Now, this has come about through a rise in moral relativists. These are people that rebel against being told what is right and what is wrong. This attitude we can find happening in society post-World War II, and we look to the 1960s with the sexual revolution, the hippie era. It led to a social decline in church attendance, and it caused some of the church to respond and adapt to what was happening. That will link you there to Joseph Fletcher's situation ethics. It was the reason he came up with that alongside Robinson. Cultural relativism takes this idea even further and suggests that morality is purely part of the changing cultures, and therefore it's very fluid. It's not a fixed absolute. This has led to people reacting against religion, which often can be quite dogmatic. Another factor is that there are so many different religions, faiths to choose from. When you're comparing all of these conflicting beliefs and similar accounts that people have of even miracles, they all say a similar thing, that this happened to them or that happened to them. but it leads to a different belief system. It becomes very difficult to then know which one is speaking truth. According to John Hick, he said, "For any particular religion, there will always be far more reason for believing it to be false than for believing it to be true. Therefore, the conclusion of many has been that it's better to believe in no God than to try and guess which one of these religions leads to the right God." There's also the issue of probability. There is not sufficient evidence that God does exist. He doesn't seem to come and make himself known to people. Therefore, it could be argued that it's more probable that he doesn't exist than that he does. Well, finally, there's this image here, which depicts a famous phrase that the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche said. He declared in his parable of the madman, "God is dead." He tells a story of a madman who lit a lantern that you can see there in the bright morning hours. He ran into the marketplace and he cried incessantly, "I am looking for God. I'm looking for God." As if many of those who did not believe in God were standing together there, people started laughing. And this was Nietzsche's way of saying, not that there is a real God and he's literally died, but that society no longer have a need for God. They've shifted and moved away from this idea, from faith. Well, that's the rise of atheism and secularization in society. Let's turn to how religion might respond to some of these influences. Let's start with empiricism. Well, this is quite straightforward. Go to religious language. Talk about A.J. Ayer and his verification principle. Because if you remember, we can reject that on the grounds that it simply doesn't verify itself. It's a flawed argument of empiricism. Also, we can look to Thomas Aquinas's design argument and cosmological argument that we've previously looked at. These show empirical evidence for God. It's observable a posteriori knowledge that uses empirical evidence to conclude something about a creator or a designer. We could also look at the topic of religious experience, like stigmata, as an example in a sect of the Catholic Church that has believed to have seen people suddenly physically receive the very marks and lacerations of Jesus at the point of when he died. And these might offer physical, empirical evidence for the supernatural. What's great about this so far is you can see how now the whole course links together and blends. Let's talk about science for a moment. We can actually use Richard Dawkins here as a counter for the influence of science on the rise of atheism. Even Dawkins has to accept, and he does, that no challenge from science has led yet to a proof that God does not exist. It is also possible to see scientific theories as being compatible with belief in God. One of the next topics to look at will be religion and science. Science can explain physical reasons for how this world has come about, but it doesn't remove the possibility that God is behind them and gives it a purpose, something which science can't do. Let's respond to evil and suffering. I'm not going to go into these arguments because you can look at the previous video on the problem of evil and suffering. But simply put, you would need to draw upon the theodicies, the defences of God from Augustine, Irenaeus, John Hick, and others, like Whitehead and Griffin. to discuss, and Hartshorne to discuss process theodicy and other defenses like free will. In order to tackle the rejection of moral absolutes, one might be able to argue that it's not a threat to believe in God unless it leads to extreme moral nihilism. And this is extremely unlikely. The idea that the whole of society will turn into complete and utter anarchy and chaos is quite a surreal idea. Also, if moral relativism is only in some specific situations, it actually could work alongside traditional religious belief in God. So if you take again Joseph Fletcher's situation ethics as an example, that is a prime way that moral relativism can coexist with religious belief. Also, many atheists would accept moral absolutes and are not moral relativists. The idea of do not kill innocent people isn't really something an atheist is likely to quibble with. How do we address there being so many different faiths? Well, one idea is to focus on religious pluralism. And this is an approach to deal with the idea that there are so many different faiths to choose from. John Hick argued that all major religious responses to a transcendent reality are all equally valid, even if the beliefs and the practices are different within them. You can make a synoptic link here, especially if you study the religion of Islam, to Sufism. Sufism is a great example of universalism here. If you take the great Sufi mystic Rumi, he once said, "The lamps are different, but the light is the same. It comes from beyond." So if you embrace religious pluralism, you can stomach the idea that there are so many different religions and faiths out there. Finally, the issue of probability could very quickly be addressed by Richard Swinburne's cumulative argument, which we've previously looked at in religious experience. He would suggest that it's more probable than not that God exists when you stack up all of the arguments that try and prove his existence. Let's look at naturalism and materialism. These are two concepts that will help us make sense of what we're about to look at. A few scholars about sociology and psychology. So naturalism is a concept that when true knowledge can only be gained through examining the world around us. Just think of nature, like in this image. It considers beliefs based on supernatural knowledge to be incorrect. And that's because you cannot empirically verify something that's metaphysical. Naturalism interprets religion as existing only in the natural order. It doesn't point to a higher or different realm, and so therefore the beliefs are a societal construct. Very important phrase to remember. And this naturalism influences sociological critiques of religion, which we're going to look at in just a moment, through Emile Durkheim and Karl Marx. The second concept is materialism. This is something that will also appear in the topic life after death. Materialism argues that only physical matter exists around us. It interprets humans to be made up of material substances, such as the mental processes in your brain are the result of the chemical changes in the brain. It denies any existence of a non-material idea, such as God. Religion is simply the result of neurological and psychological factors. And this materialism has influenced psychological critiques of religion. And we're going to look briefly at the study of Freud. So let's start with one of the two sociological critiques of religious belief that we're going to look at, Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a German philosopher. A little bit of politics and history for you here. He was a political theorist, but he was most famous for being a communist revolutionary. His views about religion are very poignant for us in this topic. He interpreted religion to be used by the elite, the ruling classes, to dominate and oppress everybody else, the masses. He believed that religion served this function because it made lots of people believe that they could escape and have freedom through the afterlife that religion offers. And he says that what it did was it stopped them from rising up against the elite, the ruling classes, to try and bring about greater equality and challenge the social order. He saw religion as a weapon. Now, when Marx was writing, workers didn't have many rights at the time. They were often exploited by factory owners and people with money. If the workers had have protested or gone on strike, that would have cost a lot of money and power for the ruling political class. Now, Marx therefore famously concluded that religion is the opium of the masses. Opium, an opiate, like heroin, is heavily addictive. This meant that religion is like a drug that changes the outlook of people, and it pacifies them, it weakens them, and it makes them subject to the socially elite. Therefore, religion has been a social construct of the ruling class. Well, let's turn to another sociologist, Emile Durkheim. He argued that religion is a sociological phenomena. He interpreted it to be a way to hold and bind society together. So not such a dark and dismal view that Marx had. To preserve and enforce the social and moral order. To create a cohesiveness between individuals, to bring them together. To give meaning and purpose to life. And this cohesiveness, this unity and order are reinforced through the performance in society of rituals. He did a lot of study of religious rituals, in particular Christianity. He said that there were ordinary objects, which are the profane, the ordinary objects that are used in rituals, and they are imbued with sacred, divine significance. Take the cross in Christianity. It's a piece of wood, but it has been given great divine, sacred significance. Durkheim, however, didn't believe there was an actual divine reality behind any of these objects, like the bread and the wine in Holy Communion, for example. It was only the meanings of society which have been projected onto them that have given them that power. Therefore, religion is also a social construct of society. Finally, let's turn to the psychological critique of religious belief. Sigmund Freud. We've looked at the natural theology, naturalism of Marx and Durkheim, and now we're looking at the materialism or physicalism of Freud. Freud argued that religion was an illusion. Now, this is not new news to us when we've looked at religious experience. And he went so far as to say that it's a neurosis, a mental illness. And he says it exists, religion is there because believers have the psychological need to project their fears, their anxieties, their subconscious onto something far greater than themselves in order to make them feel better. And it's a way to cope with helplessness, our inner impulses, our fears of death. And for all of the harsh things that Freud had to say about religion, he actually believed that if you were to take it away from people, because it's like a spiritual crutch, that it would do more damage than good. So he believed it probably should stay there while it's doing some good. Therefore, religion is simply a figment of our imagination. Moving on then to thinking about postmodernism. And this all relates to what we've looked at so far. We've looked at the descent of the modernists into atheism. And as this image shows us, starting out with a very pre-modern idea of Catholic Christianity and everybody in society believing in God. And if they didn't, maybe they're worshipping the devil or should be burnt at the stake. And slowly but surely, over the period of the Enlightenment, more and more people became skeptical. They began to question truth claims. Things became more up for debate. And as a consequence of that, atheism and secularization in society took hold. However, to understand the idea of postmodernism, so what has come after this period, we do just need to understand that period a little bit better. So there's a couple of concepts. One is a meta-narrative. This is an important idea. This is where you have one account of reality and it is objectively true whether you believe it or not. Now, this idea of a meta-narrative can apply to both theists and atheists, in that a theist has one account of reality, which for them is objectively true. They believe there is a God. For an atheist, they also have one account of reality, which they believe is objectively true, that there is not a God. Therefore, in modernism, which comes before postmodernism, in every area of life, there was a single truth claim. And it can be discovered through reason and through experience. These are the hallmarks of the Enlightenment period. Modernists claim that there is a single correct meta-narrative for a theist or an atheist. For a Christian who might choose to preach the creation story of Adam and Eve as being literally true, that would be a meta-narrative, whether or not someone else believed in it. You could take any of those steps there. Belief in God, the atonement, the resurrection, the virgin birth, miracles. These are all meta-narratives. They can be rejected by atheists, which would be their meta-narrative. But what was still clear is that you could hold on to a single truth claim. However, in the postmodern era, which comes after this age of enlightenment and reason, things started to change. Let's have a look at some of the key scholars who talk about postmodernity. This is Jacques Derrida, an Algerian-born French philosopher who developed the philosophy of deconstruction, which is a lot of what is involved in postmodern thought. He said that one needs to deconstruct and reject the meta-narrative big stories because they're impossible to tell. When applying it to religion, you would take any of those that I mentioned earlier, the resurrection of Jesus, the atonement, etc. They would need to be deconstructed. They get dissected in a postmodern mindset. They get rejected because they tell a big meta-narrative story, but it's not something that is actually able to truly be told. When it comes to societal structures, social structures are always in a state of flux in postmodern arenas. So in the modern era, you would perhaps, for example, have a lot of clarity over what the family social structure might look like. So the nuclear family was the traditional concept. Two parents, children, living together in one house, usually married. But today, everything is in such a state of change, flux, that Derrida points out things are never clear and settled and in a particular way, because that particular way gets rejected as being the only way. This means that all meaning becomes relative and it's socially constructed. It is what you want it to be. And as a consequence of all of that, the reality in which we live is fragile and it's confusing. And that's because nobody can lay claim to a single truth. Let's have a look at a second postmodern scholar, Francois-Lyotard, a French philosopher and sociologist who's known for discussing the postmodern condition. Something that he and Derrida seem to have in common is smoking. He said that science has destroyed meta-narratives, that age of reason and enlightenment put to test those religious stories and ideas and dismantled them, critiqued them, scrutinized them, and destroyed them. He says that meta-narratives are far too simplistic. That aligns with what Derrida says, that they're impossible to tell. He was able to draw upon Ludwig Wittgenstein, who you're also familiar with from religious language. And he suggested that playing language games helps to explore lots of different narratives that exist. And it takes us away from this one grand meta-narrative. So Wittgenstein's language games has become a positive thing for postmodernism. It can also be a tool to bring people together, to build community as people interact through language games. He argued that knowledge is no longer a tool of authorities. We now have choice and we have freedom of thought. And this is one of the reasons that Lyotard suggested that we should reject the age of enlightenment, that period of time should have the door well and truly closed on itself. And he also makes this reference here, which we'll touch upon again shortly, that actions and ideas are judged on how practical, how useful they are, not on how true they are. So with that background to postmodern thought in mind, let's turn to postmodern views of religion then. So here are four categories or four ways of viewing religion through the postmodern lens. So in society, perhaps today we might say, although some argue we're in a neo-postmodern era now, but that's for another time, people look at religion as a spiritual journey, a spiritual search. Don Cupid, an English philosopher of religion and Christian theology, an Anglican priest and lecturer at the University of Cambridge, he says that the best we can do is fulfill our desires by exploring imaginatively a wide variety of approaches to spiritual life. He's quite well known for his controversial anti-realist ideas. So, for postmodernists, religion is a spiritual journey that we explore. Secondly, we can see religion as a cultural construct, and this takes us back to the likes of Emile Durkheim, who said religion is the product of society, in which it is developed. This idea that it has been constructed by the society. A third way of looking at religion from a postmodern view is to say that there is no right or wrong religion. Remember, we reject the grand meta-narratives. There's no such thing as an absolute truth claim. And one of my old lecturers, Alistair McGrath, said, "There is no truth, only truths. There is no grand reason, only reasons. There is no grand narrative of human progress, only countless stories of where people and their cultures are now." McGrath is a Christian theologian who is pointing out here what the postmodern view of religion is. There is no such thing as an absolute truth claim. A fourth idea of postmodernism is that religion is practical. It's a lived religion over any intellectual faith. John Caputo, an American philosopher and professor of religion, who's very well known for discussing postmodern Christianity and deconstruction theology, he said, "Religion cannot be proven. It has a deep-seated agnostic element. Religion must be expressed through actions rather than doctrine. A Christian must express what they believe about love for their neighbour. There's no point telling people about it. Rather, it must be acted out." For Caputo, this word agnostic is very important for us. Because one thing we're going to see clearly is that in the modern era, belief in God and non-belief in God was very clear. You were a theist or you were an atheist. But in a postmodern world, agnosticism has a great role to play. It sits very well within the postmodern faith, those that sit on the fence and don't have an absolute claim to any particular truth. So, having thought about the postmodern views of religion, let's turn now to evaluating whether postmodernity supports or threatens religion. And this is something that you would need to do when evaluating postmodernism. So, what about postmodernism can support religion? If you go to William James's 4 features of a mystical experience, he refers to ineffability. This idea of not being able to articulate in words what has happened to you is a mystery. It is suited to the more mystical aspects of religion. So postmodernism suits quite well mysticism. Also, the via negativa that we've looked at describes God by saying what he is not rather than what he is, which again speaks into the mystical, transcendent nature of a supreme being. Here already we've made a link with postmodernism and religious experience and religious language. Some people believe that you can't know anything specific about God. So let's take a much more liberal Christian denomination like the Quakers. They refer to the light of God within the individual, but they don't really have any dogmatic teachings. And that's a very postmodern idea. Most religions emphasize a practical living religion. So it isn't too far removed for a postmodern idea to be found in religion. When Jesus taught to love your neighbour as you love yourself, this is a model for that practical living religion that Christians can participate in. This emphasis is therefore very postmodern. Most religions will teach that God is transcendent and exists outside of the grasp of human knowledge. And they emphasize language like faith and belief rather than words like certainty and knowledge. This mysterious embrace of God can allow for the rejection of absolute knowledge. However, it's worth noting that the type of religious belief that suits postmodern thought the best is the more liberal and less traditional religious belief. So, what about postmodernism threatens religion? Well, the emphasis on this practical living religion goes hand in hand with the truth claims of the faith. Truth claims are the basis for all practice in most religions. If you remove the truth claims and can't have them, then what is your practical lived out faith based on? There's an idea in postmodern thought that you can approach religion a bit like a pick and mix in a candy store. That you go to pick up whatever sweets you like and have a mixture of them, and you might cherry pick the bits of religion that you like. So I might like a little bit of Jesus when he talks about loving your neighbour. I might like a little bit of the Buddha when he talks about freedom from suffering. When in the Prophet Muhammad's final sermon he talks about equality, I might take a bit of that, but I might ignore other aspects of the religion that I don't like. This pick and mix approach to religion, taking religion a bit like a supermarket and putting into the basket whatever you like, undermines doctrine, which teaches that you need to commit to your faith in the face of doubt. And religion is not a product that you can buy. If you don't access any universal truths because you're not allowed to, this contradicts the key teachings of many religions. Christianity is based on truth claims. These are seen as objective reality for most Christians. Most of them consider agnostic statements about God inadequate compared to faith. They're too weak. Having so much freedom of action can contradict the moral absolutes found in religion. Anything which challenges the basis of what is right and what is wrong is a serious threat to religion. That's because it waters down these truths. And finally, the rejection of absolute truth makes it difficult to have a universal ethical code of conduct. Doubting everything could end up leading to actions where people are intolerant to others, and that's open for debate, rather than being called out as wrong. It could lead to justification for almost anything. Well, let's turn now to the works of scholars Dawkins and Westphal. Let's start with Richard Dawkins, who we're already familiar with. These are some of his clear ideas about religion. Dawkins says that religion leads to violence and war and excuses irrational actions. It makes excuses for things which don't make any sense. He says being agnostic is just simply not a position. It's meaningless because there's clear evidence, he believes, that God doesn't exist. He says that religion is the enemy of science. He believes they are incompatible. Trying to prove God through reason, like the ontological argument, he thinks is a form of word games. It's just playing around with language. Religious scriptures and revelation, he believes, are pure fiction. Religion, he says, is the opposite of morality because it condones immoral actions. An example would be Abraham in the Old Testament of the Bible being told to sacrifice his son Isaac. You might look at Jesus dying on the cross. For Dawkins, he sees this as, why would the father allow his son or want his son to die on the most horrific form of Roman execution on the cross? The condemnation of homosexuality. Dawkins sees this as the opposite of morality. He also comes up with meme theory. And this is the idea that religion is a bit like a virus that is passed down through ideas like genetics is. So a summary of not so affirmative and positive ideas from Dawkins about religion. Well, let's turn finally to Westphal. Merrill Westphal, in his paper titled The Emergence of Modern Philosophy of Religion, which you can find in this book here, A Companion to Philosophy of Religion, covers postmodern attitudes towards religion. One of them is deism. Deism uses rational and natural theology to assert that observation of the natural world is enough to believe in a supreme being. Therefore, God exists, but he doesn't intervene in the world. He plays no role in it. He also chronicles the attempts and wishes of Immanuel Kant and David Hume to find universal religious principles in reaction to Enlightenment thinking and religious conflicts of the time. He had three main aims within his thinking. The first, he addresses the importance and authority of the use of human reason. Secondly, he discusses tolerance of religion among those who are religious and those who are not. And thirdly, he discusses anti-clericalism, the idea of being opposed to religious authority, very much set within the Catholic Church, the idea of removing the political and religious authority that comes from religion. Now, all of this is discussing the impact of Western philosophy on religion. And whilst doing so, he also argues that the Enlightenment era was a shift from pre-modernity to modernity, where religious truth was questioned and the study of the philosophy of religion moved away from theological discussion that was rooted deeply in faith to the rational empirical ideas of the Enlightenment. This is something we've already looked at earlier in this presentation. He argues that this led to a shift from theism to deism. And he says that the focus was on religious belief and practice rather than knowing God himself. And this is how Western philosophy has impacted religion. So hopefully you've now got a good overall summary and timeline of the rise of atheism and secularization and where we're at possibly today and beyond with postmodern thinking, and how this affects religious belief and practice today.